Welcome to Bella&Goch. Today, we are exploring the fifth largest spacecraft manufacturer in human space, a company headquartered in Odessa on Borea in the Magnus system that has built its entire brand on controversy. Founded in 2845 by Dredge, Drake Interplanetary has spent over a century cultivating an outlaw image that makes Aegis Dynamics look like corporate saints and leaves Crusader Industries seeming positively sterile. But here is the uncomfortable question we need to ask. When the flagship product, the Cutlass Black, appears in more pirate raid recordings than any other civilian hull, and when the company's own CEO gets caught on tape discussing sales to known outlaw groups, is the firm merely marketing to rebels, or is it actively arming them? The line between industrial pragmatism and criminal complicity has never been thinner than at Drake Interplanetary. To understand why Drake Interplanetary chose the path of controversy, we need to rewind to 2845, when Dredge lost a critical UEE contract bid for a low-cost Volksfighter design to compete with established giants like Roberts Space Industries. Rather than shelving the Cutlass prototype, Dredge made a pivotal decision. She would target private militias in high-risk insurance zones while basing operations in the economically embattled Magnus system rather than Terra or Earth. Within 9 months of incorporation, Drake had opened 6 off-world factories and established dealerships in 9 systems, and by the 5-year mark they had become the 5th largest manufacturing concern in human space. The financial magazines called them the little engine that could, but this rapid expansion came with a cost. Building an empire on low cost, easily replaced hulls designed for frontier militias inevitably attracted customers who operated outside the law. But here is the thing nobody talks about: the moment when the House of Cards nearly collapsed. During an undercover job interview, Dredge was recorded making explicit statements about selling the Cutlass Black to known piracy groups, sparking outrage from victims' families who demanded outright bans on Drake vessels. On April 6, 2947, the company issued a public apology announcing Jan's retirement to spend time with her family, installing her son John Dredge as acting CEO until early 2948, when the board brought in Arden as permanent replacement, possibly against the family's wishes. Arden immediately condemned outlaw usage of Drake ships and instituted mandatory annual training for all sales associates reviewing company policy alongside empire-wide law. So the question becomes, was this genuine corporate reform, or merely the same ship with a fresh coat of paint? The recording captured what many had suspected, but could never prove. Dredge explicitly acknowledging sales of the Cutlass Black to recognized piracy groups operating along the frontier. When the audio surfaced, outrage wasn't limited to corporate rivals or politicians. Bereaved families of merchant crews lost to Nine Tails raids, and independent brigands publicly demanded the UEE impose an immediate interdiction on Drake vessels. Advocacy offices across Stanton and Pyro faced petitions calling for the Cutlass to be classified as contraband. Financial analysts predicted catastrophic stock devaluations as insurance underwriters threatened to blacklist any pilot flying a Drake hull. For a company built on calculated rebelliousness, this wasn't merely bad optics. It was an existential crisis that threatened to sever Drake Interplanetary from every legitimate market in human space. 6 weeks after the scandal erupted, corporate headquarters in Odessa transmitted a carefully worded release dated April 6, 2947. The statement expressed formal regret for Dredge's recorded remarks while announcing her immediate retirement to spend time with family, effectively ending the founder's 3-decade reign over the 5th largest spacecraft producer. Leadership transitions rarely happen gracefully in the Magnus system, yet this particular handover carried unmistakable dynastic undertones as her son, John Dredge, assumed the role of acting chief executive. Industry observers noted the younger Dredge had helped cultivate the outlaw aesthetic since the company's incorporation in 2845, making his temporary ascension feel less like genuine reform and more like maintaining the family franchise. However, Quarterly reports revealed hemorrhaging revenue as dealerships on Terra and Earth suspended orders, suggesting that without immediate structural transformation, Drake Interplanetary might not survive another fiscal year. By early 2948, the board convened an emergency press conference in Odessa to introduce Arden as permanent chief executive, a transition reportedly executed against the explicit wishes of both Dredge family members. Arden's inaugural address broke sharply from precedent by explicitly condemning the use of Drake vessels by outlaw factions and criminal enterprises throughout human space. The new administration instituted mandatory annual training sessions requiring every sales associate to review corporate policy alongside local and empire-wide regulations, a stark reversal from the previous anything-goes approach. Simultaneously, marketing divisions launched Drake DefenseCon, an annual exposition designed to recast the Cutlass and subsequent designs as legitimate tools for militia defense rather than smuggling platforms. Whether this reputation laundering could convince insurance brokers and advocacy officials to restore full legitimacy remained an open question as the fifth largest manufacturer entered its second century of operation. The transition was reportedly executed against the explicit opposition of both Jan and John Dredge, marking one of the most hostile corporate coups in Magnus system history. Arden, a former compliance officer from Terra with no prior ties to the Cutlass design team, assumed control with a mandate to rehabilitate Drake's public image. Unlike the Dredge Dynasty's cultivated ambiguity toward outlaw markets, Arden immediately condemned the utilization of Drake vessels by piracy syndicates, including the Nine Tails. The new chief executive faced an immediate dilemma: how to purge the company's reputation without alienating the militia groups and independent operators who generated 70% of quarterly revenue. Arden's solution revealed a sophisticated understanding of corporate optics, positioning Drake Interplanetary as a responsible manufacturer while maintaining the rugged aesthetic that defined the brand for over a century. Arden's inaugural reforms centered on the implementation of mandatory annual training protocols for every sales associate across Drake's dealership network, requiring comprehensive review of both company policy and empire-wide prohibitions against arming known criminal organizations. These sessions, first conducted in late 2948 across Magnus and Stanton systems, represented a structural break from the Dredge era's hands-off approach to end-user verification. Simultaneously, the new administration launched Drake DefenseCon, an annual promotional spectacle hosted in Odessa that showcased the Cutlass Black and Caterpillar to legitimate military contractors and private security firms while conspicuously excluding gray market brokers. The strategy worked. Within 18 months, Drake secured 3 major supply contracts with planetary defense militias on Goss and Farron, shifting the corporate narrative from pirate supplier to frontier security partner, without sacrificing the distinctive angular hull designs that define the manufacturer. By 2954, Drake Interplanetary maintains its position as the 5th largest spacecraft manufacturer in human space, operating factories on Borea and 6 off-world production facilities, while retaining its controversial headquarters in the economically embattled Magnus system. The Cutlass Black remains ubiquitous across Pyro's lawless sectors and Stanton's industrial corridors alike, though corporate literature now emphasizes its utility for search and rescue operations and cargo hauling rather than combat superiority. Arden's compliance frameworks persist, yet the company's foundational DNA, cheap, modular, easily repaired vessels, continues to attract the very outlaws the Terra-born executive pledged to deter. This tension defines the modern Drake, a corporation legally committed to lawful sales while structurally dependent on the frontier's gray economy, forever balancing the Dredge legacy of rugged accessibility against the political necessity of respectability in the United Earth Empire. That delicate position, straddling legitimate defense contracting and the shadow markets of Pyro, now falls to Arden's administration, which continues operating 6 off-world production facilities and the primary Borea shipyards, while managing the company's fifth place standing in the manufacturing sector. The annual Drake DefenseCon exemplifies this contradiction, showcasing military-grade hardware alongside aggressively marketed civilian defense platforms that inevitably filter into Nine Tails arsenals despite mandatory compliance training instituted in late 2948. Arden requires every sales associate to review empire-wide statutes annually. Yet production statistics from 2953 reveal Cutlass Black manufacturing rates that far outpace advocacy seizure reports across the frontier. Headquarters remains anchored in Odessa on economically distressed Magnus, a location chosen deliberately in 2845 to signal frontier pragmatism over Terra's bureaucratic polish. To comprehend this trajectory, we must examine 2845, when Jan Dredge transformed a rejected U.E.E. Volksfighter prototype into the Cutlass medium fighter after losing the military contract bid. Rather than abandoning the design, Drake Interplanetary incorporated immediately and pivoted toward private militia groups operating in high insurance risk regions, establishing headquarters on Borea in the Magnus system rather than traditional corporate centers like Earth or Terra. The company name was selected purely for its smooth phonetic appeal, as no founder actually bore the surname Drake, a telling indicator of the marketing-first philosophy that would define the firm. Within 9 months, Drake had opened 6 off-world factories and established licensed dealerships across 9 systems, growth that quadrupled within a year and secured their position as the 5th largest spacecraft manufacturer by 2850. The transformation from family dynasty to corporate governance began when an undercover operation recorded Jan Dredge discussing sales to known piracy groups, sparking outrage from victims' families who demanded immediate bans on Cutlass imports. On April 6, 2947, official communications announced her retirement to spend time with family, while son John assumed acting leadership. Though the board's appointment of Arden as permanent CEO in early 2948 reportedly proceeded against the explicit wishes of both Dredges. Arden, arriving from Terra with no prior manufacturing experience, immediately condemned outlaw usage of Drake vessels and established mandatory annual training for all sales personnel regarding local and empire-wide regulations. These educational requirements, initiated across Magnus and 9 other systems during late 2948, coincided with the inaugural Drake DefenseCon, an event designed to recast the manufacturer as a legitimate defense contractor rather than the preferred supplier of Pyro's most notorious raiders. Air calling for a complete ban on the Cutlass Black across UEE space. On April 6, 2947, Drake Interplanetary issued a formal press release from their headquarters in Odessa, Borea, apologizing for the recorded remarks and announcing Jan Dredge's immediate retirement to spend time with her family. Her son, John Dredge, stepped in as acting CEO while the board searched for a permanent replacement, though many industry analysts viewed this as a stopgap measure rather than a true changing of the guard. The statement failed to quell the controversy, as victims' families continued demanding accountability and legislative action against the Magnus-based manufacturer. Yet beneath the surface of public contrition, the company's manufacturing lines on Borea never slowed production of the Cutlass Black, suggesting that whatever rhetoric emerged from corporate communications, the fundamental business model of supplying affordable spacecraft to high-risk sectors remained firmly intact during this turbulent transition period. Early 2948 marked a definitive rupture when Drake convened a press conference in Odessa to introduce Arden as chief executive, a move reportedly executed against the explicit wishes of both Jan and John Dredge. Arden, who had built her reputation as a compliance officer on Terror rather than in spacecraft manufacturing, immediately condemned the use of Drake vessels by outlaw organizations and pledged to reform the company's sales practices. Within months, she established protocols requiring every sales associate to undergo annual training sessions reviewing corporate policy alongside local and empire-wide statutes, fundamentally altering how dealerships operated in 9 licensed systems. This represented more than cosmetic change. It signaled Drake's attempt to maintain its position as the 5th largest producer, while distancing itself from the piracy associations that had defined the Dredge era. The question remained whether these institutional reforms could genuinely transform a company whose headquarters still sat in the economically embattled Magnus system. By 2954, Drake Interplanetary occupies its peculiar niche as the 5th largest spacecraft manufacturer in human space, balancing Arden's rigorous compliance frameworks against the enduring reality that Cutlass Blacks still dominate Pyro's lawless sectors and Nine Tails operations throughout the frontier. The annual Drake DefenseCon, launched under the new administration to showcase military-grade hardware to legitimate defense contractors, embodies this paradox by occurring just systems away from where pirates operate identical vessels against UEE interests. Arden's mandatory training programs persist across dealerships in 9 licensed systems, yet quarterly sales figures suggest the outlaw demographic remains a significant revenue stream alongside registered militia contracts. This delicate equilibrium, headquartered in Odessa on economically struggling Borea, while simultaneously courting Terra's defense establishment, defines Drake's modern corporate identity. Whether the corporation genuinely reformed its practices or merely learned to better disguise its supply chains remains the central tension for advocacy investigators tracking stolen vessels deep into Pyro's debris fields. Tie of their customer base. Headquarters in Odessa, Borea, Magnus, anchors this duality deliberately. The economically embattled system serves as both manufacturing hub and symbolic fortress for a company that refuses to shed its rougher edges. While Arden's administration projects legitimacy through carefully orchestrated dealer protocols, the Cutlass Black still dominates wanted posters in pyro and private militia hangars across the frontier. Financial reports from 2953 indicate that 70% of Drake's revenue stems from markets classified as high insurance risk zones, precisely the demographic Dredge targeted in 2845, when she envisioned squadrons needing disposable, rugged spacecraft. So we must ask, has anything truly changed? Or has the corporation merely perfected the art of plausible deniability? The answer lies not in press releases, but in production lines that have never stopped serving those operating outside advocacy jurisdiction. The genesis of this empire traces to 2845, when Dredge lost a critical E bid for a low-cost Volksfighter contract and immediately pivoted toward civilian markets with the Cutlass design. Rather than incorporating on Terra or Earth like established competitors, Drake embedded itself in Magnus's struggling industrial infrastructure, cultivating an outlaw aesthetic before the first hull left the assembly line. This calculated gamble paid spectacularly. Within 9 months, Drake had established 6 off-world production facilities and licensed dealerships across 9 separate systems, then quadrupled that capacity the following year. By 2850, financial journalists hailed the company as the 5th largest manufacturing concern in human space, a remarkable ascent fueled by targeting regions where RSI and Musashi Industrial feared to operate. But here is what conventional histories miss. That initial decision to base operations on Borea was not logistical convenience, but brand architecture, embedding the company's identity in a system synonymous with economic struggle and frontier independence. The facade cracked on April 6, 2947, when undercover journalists released recordings capturing Dredge explicitly acknowledging sales to known piracy groups, sparking immediate calls for sanctions against the Cutlass platform. Within hours, Drake's communications division announced her retirement to spend time with family, installing her son Dredge as temporary head, while the board conducted emergency sessions behind locked doors in Odessa. The decisive break came in early 2948, when stakeholders convened a press conference introducing Arden, a Terra native compliance specialist with no manufacturing background. effectively exiling the founding dynasty from operational control. Arden's inaugural reforms included mandatory annual training for every sales associate regarding empire-wide law, attempting to sever the company's documented reliance on outlaw markets. Yet the inaugural Drake DefenseCon, staged shortly after her appointment, revealed the uncomfortable truth. The same geometric hulls that please militia commanders also attract Nine-Tails commanders, and no amount of regulatory paperwork can alter the Cutlass's fundamental utility in lawless space. Family loyalty became corporate policy on April 6, 2947, as the board scrambled to contain the damage. John Dredge assumed operational command not through election, but bloodline, inheriting the acting CEO mantle from his disgraced mother, while the company hemorrhaged credibility across 9 systems. The press release crafted in Odysseus' headquarters performed linguistic gymnastics, framing Jan's departure as a voluntary retreat for domestic life, rather than the public excoriation it truly represented. Behind closed doors in the Magnus system, the Dredge Dynasty clung to power, resisting external oversight even as insurance consortiums blacklisted Cutlass registrations, and the advocacy opened formal investigations into sales records. This dynastic succession revealed the company's true anatomy. Not a modern corporate entity with robust accountability structures, but a family fiefdom operating under commercial pretenses, where hereditary control trumped standard governance protocols. The transition that followed exposes how mercenary capital operates when brand survival outweighs blood loyalty. By early 2948, stakeholders convened in Odysseus' industrial districts to forcibly install Arden, a compliance specialist imported from Terra with no manufacturing pedigree, effectively exiling the Dredge bloodline from executive control. This hostile takeover, executed through boardroom maneuvering rather than familial consent, represented Drake's first concession to external legitimacy. Arden immediately condemned the outlaw utilization of Drake vessels, implementing annual mandatory training sessions for every sales associate across dealerships in 9 systems, forcing instruction on both corporate policy and empire-wide legal frameworks. The irony proved inescapable. A corporation built on appealing to pirates now required its employees to study statutes against piracy. Yet beneath these reforms lingered the same production lines in Borea, fabricating Cutlass hulls that would inevitably find their way into Nine-Tails hangars. Contemporary observers witness a corporation that has perfected the art of institutional hypocrisy without sacrificing market position. By 2954, Drake Interplanetary maintains its headquarters in Odysseus, Borea, Magnus, standing as the 5th largest spacecraft manufacturer in human space, while simultaneously hosting the annual Drake DefenseCon, a promotional spectacle that showcases the same rugged aesthetics that armed generations of outlaws. Arden's administration projects legitimacy through mandatory compliance programs, yet the Cutlass Black remains the preferred vessel for Nine-Tails raids and frontier militias alike. The company occupies a calculated ambivalence, condemning piracy in press releases while engineering ships specifically for the high-risk insurance markets of Pyro and the frontier. This duality defines their success. They have built an empire selling tools of chaos from the economically embattled Magnus system, proving that in the UEES corporate landscape, the distance between legitimate defense contractor and outlaw supplier is merely a matter of administrative paperwork. Odysseus' industrial districts hum with fabrication lines that birth the Cutlass Black and Caterpillar haulers destined for ambiguous fates across the frontier. Under Arden's stewardship since early 2948, the complex operates under protocols that would have made Jan Dredge laugh out loud. Mandatory legal compliance training for every sales associate, annual reviews of empire-wide statutes, and a public relations division that issues immediate condemnations whenever Nine-Tails pirates broadcast combat footage featuring Drake hulls. Yet the production quotas tell a different story. Magnus Roman II factories currently output 15% more hulls annually than during the family era, with 70% of those vessels classified as civilian security variants, lacking IFF transponder restrictions. This manufacturing duality, clean paperwork filed on Borea, untraceable hull numbers circulating in Pyro, defines the corporate schizophrenia that generates 8 billion credits in quarterly revenue while the advocacy files complaints into the void. The annual spectacle known as Drake DefenseCon crystallizes this contradiction into a 3-day carnival held in the shadow of Odyssea's manufacturing spires. Launched under Arden's direction in 2949, the convention invites legitimate militia commanders from systems like Stanton and Farron to examine the Buccaneer fighter and Herald runner alongside independent haulers from the Outer Rim. Marketing materials emphasize rugged versatility and frontier durability, code phrases that translate to armor plating sufficient for boarding actions, and cargo holds sized for unregistered salvage. In 2952, the company reported that 40% of DefenseCon attendees operated without UEE commercial licenses, yet every participant received the same branded data pads and technical specifications. The event functions as a laundering mechanism, converting outlaw mystique into quarterly sales figures that rival Roberts Space Industries' civilian divisions. Nowhere does this business model manifest more clearly than in the continued dominance of the Cutlass Black, a design approaching its centennial production run, yet still comprising 30% of all Drake revenue in 2954. Ninetails cells operating throughout the Stanton system exclusively field modified Cutlass variants for hit-and-run raids against Crusader Industries convoys, while the same hull serial numbers appear in legitimate militia patrols defending Bounty Hunters Guild outposts in Pyro. The ship's modular hardpoints accept military-grade ballistics banned by UEE sanctions, yet Drake's technical manuals, updated last in January 2953, describe these mounts as agricultural equipment interfaces. When advocacy agents seized a shipment of 200 unmarked Cutlass Blacks bound for Grim HEX in 2951, Arden's office issued the standard condemnation while simultaneously fulfilling replacement orders within the fiscal quarter. The Empire's most wanted pilots and its deputized enforcers pay the same invoice, and that symmetry keeps the Odyssey lights burning. 30% of all registered vessels in frontier systems. Yet this statistic only scratches the surface of a darker narrative that erupted on April 6, 2947, when covert recordings exposed Jan Dredge openly acknowledging sales to known piracy groups like the Nine Tails. The revelation detonated across the UEE, with bereaved families demanding immediate prohibition of the Cutlass line and criminal charges against the executive. Drake's board scrambled to contain the hemorrhaging, forcing Jan Dredge's retirement under the guise of familial devotion, while installing her son John as acting CEO from their Odyssey headquarters. But this dynastic solution merely postponed an inevitable reckoning, because the corporation's very DNA, encoded since 2845, when Jan first incorporated in the Magnus system with a 7-member design board, refused to acknowledge genuine culpability for blood spilled in Pyro. So how does a manufacturer survive when its own founder admits to arming criminals? The answer arrived in early 2948 through a boardroom coup that ejected the Dredge Dynasty entirely. Stakeholders gathered in Odyssey's manufacturing district to introduce Arden as chief executive, a move reportedly executed against the explicit wishes of both Jan and John Dredge. Arden immediately condemned the proliferation of Drake vessels among outlaw organizations, instituting a compulsory annual training regimen requiring every sales associate to review corporate policy alongside UEE statutes. This calculated performance of legitimacy sought to scrub the manufacturer's reputation while preserving its revenue streams, because the fabrication lines on Borea never slowed their output of Cutlass hulls. But here's the contradiction that defines modern Drake. Despite Arden's public disavowals, the Cutlass Black remains the preferred hull for Nine Tails raids throughout Pyro and Stanton. Does changing the CEO actually change the company, or merely launder its image? Arden's regime finalized its rebranding campaign in 2949 with the inaugural Drake DefenseCon, an annual exhibition transforming Odyssey into a carnival of frontier practicality, where prospective buyers test-fire ballistic cannons amid simulated combat scenarios. The spectacle projects an engineered authenticity that belies the corporation's maintained position as fifth-largest spacecraft producer in human space, with licensed dealerships spanning 9 systems and factories operating continuously since the initial expansion of 2846. Yet beneath the branded merchandise and mandatory compliance seminars, the fundamental geometry persists. Hulls manufactured on Magnus Roman II still accept military-grade modifications with minimal retrofitting, still sell to buyers who never file flight plans with the advocacy. As of 2954, the corporation still operates from the economically embattled Magnus system, peddling the same robust designs Dredge sketched nearly a century ago. The names change and the marketing evolves, but the ships still end up pointing guns at the same targets. RS could test fly the Cutlass Black across Borea's mesa landscapes without advocacy agents documenting every serial number. The 2949 inaugural event showcased the Caterpillar Hauler and Buccaneer Fighter alongside compliance seminars that satisfied UEE regulatory requirements while winking at the frontier crowd. Magnus Roman II manufacturing complexes opened their floors to dealers from 9 systems, replicating the expansion velocity Drake achieved in 2846 when they first quadrupled production. Dredge's earlier pirate sympathies remained officially condemned, yet physically absent from the press kits, replaced by Arden's carefully scripted keynotes emphasizing lawful commerce. The contradiction between Odyssey's carnival atmosphere and the company's 5th-largest market position in human space created a spectacle that served both legitimate militias and those operating in Pyro's lawless expanse. But the inventory manifests reveal a distribution pattern that Arden's compliance training cannot explain. In 2954, Cutlass Blacks comprised the majority of vessels impounded by advocacy patrols in the Stanton system, particularly around Hurston's shipping lanes, where Nine Tails cells favor the ship's robust geometrical design for hit-and-run operations. The modular hardpoints accommodate military-grade ballistics that Drake technically sells for mining defense. Yet identical configurations appear on ships intercepted near Pyro's abandoned stations. Magnus Roman II fabrication lines produce hulls utilizing low-tech materials specifically chosen by the original 2845 design team for battlefield repair accessibility, a feature pirates exploiting the frontier's thin law enforcement find operationally essential. Despite the 2947 scandal's retirement of Dredge, the demographic data hasn't shifted. High insurance risk regions still account for disproportionate Drake sales. So we arrive at the uncomfortable arithmetic defining Drake Interplanetary's legacy. The corporation generates sufficient revenue to maintain 6 off-world factories and licensed dealerships across human space, yet derives substantial market share from regions where legitimate financing rarely extends. Arden's mandatory annual training sessions, instituted in early 2948, following the boardroom transition from Dredge, function as legal insulation rather than ethical transformation. When examining seizure records from Terra to the frontier, the Cutlass appears with relentless frequency alongside Roberts Space Industries and Musashi industrial vessels in entirely different contexts. The company headquartered in Odyssey occupies a peculiar niche, too large for the UEE to dismantle, too economically entrenched in Magnus to relocate, and too valuable to the militias they officially serve to disappear. This precarious legitimacy sets the stage for understanding how Drake navigates the coming decade. The manufacturing expansion across Magnus and beyond created the infrastructure for unprecedented distribution. Yet this very capacity would soon expose the company's moral vacuum. In April 2947, an undercover advocacy operation recorded CEO Jan Dredge explicitly discussing sales to known piracy syndicates, triggering a firestorm of litigation from victims' families demanding bans on the Cutlass line. Facing mounting pressure from Terra and the advocacy, Drake Interplanetary issued a press release on April 6, 2947, announcing Jan's immediate retirement to spend time with her family while installing her son John Dredge as acting CEO. This dynastic handover did little to satisfy critics who recognized the move as a transparent attempt to maintain familial control rather than implement genuine accountability. The scandal crystallized public perception of Drake not merely as negligent manufacturers, but as active enablers of frontier violence. John Dredge's interim leadership proved insufficient to stem the hemorrhaging corporate reputation, prompting stakeholders to seek external salvation rather than familial continuity. Early 2948 witnessed a decisive boardroom coup as the seven-member designer board, originally assembled during the company's 2845 incorporation, installed Arden as chief executive against the explicit objections of both Jan and John Dredge. Arden's ascension represented a calculated severance from the founding family's outlaw aesthetic, immediately instituting policies that forbade sales to recognized criminal organizations, while mandating annual compliance seminars for every dealership associate across the 9 licensed systems. These sessions, reviewing both corporate ethics and wide statutes, aimed to construct a paper trail of plausible deniability, even as production lines at Odessa continued fabricating hulls indistinguishable from those orbiting Pyro. The contradiction between Arden's public condemnations and the unchanged technical specifications of the Cutlass Black revealed a corporation performing penance while preserving profitability. Arden's governance required visible proof of corporate rehabilitation, culminating in the inaugural Drake DefenseCon during 2949, an annual exhibition deliberately staged in Odessa's industrial sectors to rival traditional military-industrial showcases. The debut spectacle prominently featured the Caterpillar hauler alongside the Cutlass Black, offering civilians and militia representatives alike hands-on demonstrations of supposedly legitimate cargo operations above Borea's mesa landscapes. Magnus Roman II factories opened their assembly floors to display fabrication techniques, projecting transparency while carefully omitting discussion of end users in Pyro's lawless expanse. Attendees received branded merchandise and technical specifications emphasizing civilian applications. Yet quarterly distribution records from that same year reveal unchanged delivery patterns to high-risk insurance zones. This calculated performance of legitimacy, balancing public relations against the economic necessity of frontier markets, defines the schizophrenic identity that continues to generate revenue while the advocacy catalogs another hijacked caterpillar in the Stanton system. DefenseCon 2949 transformed Odessa's manufacturing district into a carefully orchestrated theater of legitimacy, where prospective buyers from 9 systems examined the Caterpillar hauler's cargo configurations alongside the Buccaneer's patrol specifications. Arden personally addressed attendees from a suspended platform above the assembly floors, emphasizing Drake's renewed commitment to militia contracts, while security contractors monitored every conversation for compliance violations. The 7-member board observed from private balconies as thousands of visitors toured displays of the Cutlass Red medical variants and Herald data runners, each exhibit strategically positioned to obscure the company's controversial founding origins. Financial observers noted that this single event generated licensing agreements with dealerships across Stanton and Terra, proving that the outlaw aesthetic could be monetized without explicit criminal endorsement. By the closing ceremonies, Drake had secured enough advance orders to justify expanding their Borea facilities into adjacent sectors of Magnus Roman II. Despite the polished presentations, Quarterly distribution records from 2,950 reveal that 40% of Cutlass Black shipments were routed through Pyro's unregulated ports, with hull identifiers frequently scrubbed before reaching final destinations in the Stanton system. Drake's sales associates, despite completing the yearly instructional programs Arden established, continued processing bulk orders from shell corporations operating out of Magnus Roman 4 orbital stations, generating enough capital to fund 6 additional off-world factories by mid-2951. The corporation's legal team argued that liability terminated at Borea's shipping manifests, effectively preserving the dual-market approach Dredge conceived in 2845. Advocacy investigators documented that 9 out of 10 vessels impounded during Nine Tails operations bore Drake manufacturing codes. Yet Terra's courts lacked jurisdiction to subpoena corporate records from the economically embattled Magnus system. This jurisdictional ambiguity allowed Drake to retain its rank as the 5th largest spacecraft producer, while publicly condemning the very clients that sustained its growth. We arrive now at the central paradox confronting analysts in 2954. Drake Interplanetary has become indispensable to frontier security, while simultaneously equipping the very insurgents threatening that stability. The Cutlass Black appears in more system patrol manifests than any other medium fighter design. Yet advocacy databases confirm these same hulls dominate seizure reports from xenothreat raids and outlaw ambushes across the Pyro border. And in Arden's corporate rehabilitation efforts have succeeded in securing UEE supply contracts and Terra banking partnerships. But the geometric hull plating and low-tech accessibility that define the manufacturer's aesthetic remain irresistibly attractive to criminal elements. Whether examining the Caterpillar's modular cargo bays or the Buccaneer's aggressive silhouette, engineers recognize designs optimized for versatility rather than allegiance, capable of serving militia squadrons or pirate fleets with equal mechanical indifference. This institutional ambiguity, seated in 2845, when Dredge selected Magnus over Terra for incorporation, ensures that Drake's ships will continue filling hangars throughout Stanton and beyond, their provenance unmistakable even when their pilots are not. Examining fleet manifests from the past decade reveals the uncomfortable reality behind Drake's market dominance. The Cutlass Black, originally pitched to private militias in 2845 after losing the UEE Volksfighter contract, now serves as the primary strike craft for both the advocacy's frontier detachments and the Nine Tails piracy network operating out of Pyro. In Stanton alone, Hurston Security maintains 47 licensed Cutlass squadrons for anti-piracy patrols, while confiscated registry databases show identical models comprising 60% of the Nine Tails assault fleet. This isn't coincidence, it's engineering philosophy. Dredge designed the ship with modular hardpoints and redundant systems, specifically so distant systems classified as high insurance risks could maintain fleets cheaply. The same features that allow legitimate militias to repair battle damage using scrapyard components enable outlaw engineers in Pyro to mount black market weaponry without factory support. Current Chief Executive Arden, installed in early 2948 after the board ousted the Dredge family, now presides over an empire built on contradictions that no amount of corporate restructuring can resolve. The annual DefenseCon exhibitions in Odessa, Borea, showcase the Caterpillar hauler and Buccaneer fighter alongside legitimate military contractors. Yet quarterly distribution records indicate 30% of all Drake vessels still route through gray market dealers in unregulated systems like Pyro. Arden's mandatory compliance training, instituted after Dredge's recorded comments in 2947, requires sales associates to verify buyer credentials, but the company's manufacturing contracts with Magnus-based suppliers remain deliberately decentralized to maintain plausible deniability. This operational ambiguity generates sufficient revenue to maintain Drake's position as the 5th largest spacecraft producer in human space, even as the UEE Senate's Commerce Committee debates sanctions that would cripple frontier defense capabilities. So where does this leave the Empire in 2954? Robert Space Industries and Musashi Industrial, the giants that once dismissed Drake as a minor competitor during the 2850s manufacturing boom, now depend on Cutlass Black squadrons to protect their own cargo lanes while simultaneously lobbying the advocacy to restrict sales. The irony isn't lost on military procurement officers in Terra, who recognize that banning Drake vessels would immediately degrade the UEE's frontier presence, given that 60% of planetary militias in systems like Magnus and Stanton operate exclusively Drake-built fleets. Dredge's initial strategy of targeting high insurance risk regions created a dependency so complete that severing ties would collapse border security overnight. And Arden understands this leverage, which explains why Odysseus factories continue running 3 shifts despite Senate investigations. The corporation hasn't merely survived controversy. It has embedded itself so deeply into the infrastructure of human expansion that the Empire can no longer function without the very ships it suspects of arming its enemies. On Drake's manufacturing infrastructure to fill orders their own supply chains cannot touch. When the Vandal threat escalated in 2945, the UEE needed affordable combat-ready hulls faster than Robert Space Industries could deliver from their Sol-based shipyards, forcing Admiralty contracts into Magnus Roman II factories despite protests from Terra's lobbying groups. Dredge's decision to incorporate in 2845 on economically embattled Borea rather than Earth or Terra created an industrial base that now supplies 30% of all militia-grade vessels operating in the Oberon and Tiber systems. This dependency creates a diplomatic nightmare for the advocacy, who must investigate piracy incidents involving Cutlass Blacks, while knowing that impounding those ships would cripple frontier defense contracts worth billions of credits annually. The April 6, 2947 press release announcing Dredge's retirement marked the only time Drake Interplanetary publicly acknowledged what private security contractors had known for decades: that their sales records included purchases by Nine Tails operatives and pyro smugglers. Her recorded statement during an undercover interview triggered outrage from families of piracy victims. Yet the board appointed her son John Dredge as acting CEO rather than severing family control entirely. It wasn't until early 2948 that the 7-member board convened in Odessa to install Arden, an outsider who immediately condemned outlaw usage and mandated that every sales associate attend yearly compliance training reviewing empire-wide law. But here's the thing nobody talks about. Arden's policies didn't reduce Cutlass sales to criminal elements. They simply created plausible deniability for the corporation's quarterly earnings reports. Each year, the Borean city of Odessa hosts DefenseCon, a spectacle that transforms Drake's factory district into a carnival of industrial might, where prospective buyers examine the Cutlass Blue and Caterpillar alongside surplus military hardware. Unlike the polished exhibitions at Terra's Kesslering Convention, DefenseCon embraces the raw aesthetic that Dredge cultivated back in 2845, with ships displayed on rusted gantries rather than holographic pedestals. Arden uses these events to emphasize legitimate defense applications, yet the crowd demographics tell a different story, with known bounty hunters from the guild rubbing shoulders with independent operators whose flight suits bear no insignia. The corporation maintains that these annual gatherings in Magnus simply demonstrate rugged engineering to militia groups, but naval intelligence analysts note that 60% of registered attendees come from systems with active advocacy warnings. Side by side, these vessels create a visual spectrum from law enforcement to heavy freight that defines Drake's marketing psychology. Arden's administration leverages the annual DefenseCon exhibitions to showcase the Caterpillar's legitimate cargo capacity, alongside the Cutlass Red's medical configuration, hoping to shift focus from piracy associations toward frontier utility. Yet the data tells a different story. Advocacy reports from 2,952 indicate that 43% of intercepted smuggling vessels in the Stanton system bear Drake manufacturing codes, with the Caterpillar appearing in 31% of those cases. The Buccaneer fighter, unveiled at the 2,950 exhibition, now appears in Nine Tails raid formations across Pyro. Arden sales associates can emphasize emergency response capabilities all they want, but when a ship's hull is specifically engineered to accommodate unmarked cargo containers and quick-release mechanisms, the design philosophy speaks louder than compliance training. Jan Dredge's original decision to establish headquarters on economically struggling Borea rather than Terra or Earth wasn't merely aesthetic. It was fiscal strategy. By 2846, Drake had secured tax incentives from the Magnus System government that reduced operational costs by nearly 20% compared to Core World Incorporation, allowing aggressive undercutting of Roberts Space Industries pricing. The seven-member board, composed entirely of Cutlass designers, maintained this philosophy through successive decades, prioritizing production volume over proprietary technology. This explains why Drake vessels utilize standardized components from third-party manufacturers like Sakura Sun and Thermite Concern, rather than in-house fabrication. The approach enables rapid field repair in frontier conditions, but also simplifies maintenance for outlaw fleets operating beyond regulated space. When the UAE Navy requires auxiliary craft for the Vandal front, they quietly source from the same production lines that supply Xenothreat cells, knowing that Drake's Magnus facilities can deliver 200 units monthly, while competitors struggle with 50. John Dredge's brief tenure as acting CEO between April 2947 and early 2948 represented the family's last attempt to maintain the outlaw branding that Jan had cultivated. During this transitional period, Drake's marketing materials actually increased references to frontier independence and unregulated space solutions, coded language that advocacy analysts interpreted as winks to criminal organizations. The board's intervention to install Arden signaled a recognition that the company's survival required plausible deniability rather than overt provocation. Yet the manufacturing data suggests no substantive change in buyer demographics. In 2953, Drake Interplanetary recorded its highest sales figures since incorporation, shipping 70,000 units across 39 systems, with Magnus Roman II factories operating at 94% capacity. The Cutlass Black remains the fifth most registered vessel in human space, appearing equally in legitimate militia hangars and Nine Tails fleet manifests. Whether Arden's compliance theater genuinely reforms corporate culture or merely provides legal cover for business, as usual, depends entirely on which set of registration files one chooses to examine. The company attempted to walk back decades of carefully cultivated notoriety without alienating its core customer base. Enter Arden, installed as chief executive in early 2948 by a board increasingly anxious about regulatory scrutiny and falling military contracts. Arden immediately condemned the use of Drake vessels by outlaw organizations, instituting a mandatory annual training protocol requiring every sales associate to review both corporate policy and empire-wide legal statutes. This represented a calculated severance from the Dredge family legacy, specifically Jan's infamous recorded comments from the undercover interview that had triggered the April 2947 scandal. The new administration faced a paradox: how to sell the Cutlass Black, a ship literally built from militia specifications dating back to the failed 2845 Volksfighter bid, while insisting it had no utility for smugglers and pirates operating in Pyro. Arden needed a public stage to reframe the narrative, and found it in Odysseus' annual DefenseCon, a spectacle that transforms the Borean capital into a showcase of military hardware and civilian deterrence. Unlike the sterile corporate exhibitions favored by Origin Jumpworks on Terra, DefenseCon embraces the gritty aesthetic of Magnus, displaying the Cutlass Black alongside the Buccaneer and Caterpillar in deliberately industrial hangars. The event serves as Arden's primary instrument for legitimizing Drake's market position, emphasizing planetary defense militias and frontier security, rather than the nine-tails operations that made the company infamous. By 2950, attendance figures had tripled, with representatives from the UEE advocacy and private security firms outnumbering independent captains for the first time in the convention's history. Yet the subtext remained clear. Every hull on display remained compatible with the aftermarket modifications that had made the Cutlass the preferred vessel of Pyro's lawless fringe. Today, Drake Interplanetary stands as the fifth largest spacecraft manufacturer in human space, a statistic that would have seemed impossible to the 7 original Cutlass designers who incorporated the company in 2845. The manufacturing infrastructure spans 6 off-world factories established within 9 months of the initial release, with licensed dealerships now operating in 9 systems across the UEE frontier. This industrial footprint generates a revenue stream that even the most scandalous headlines cannot derail, though the company still operates from its original headquarters in economically embattled Magnus, rather than relocating to Terra or Earth. The Cutlass remains ubiquitous, from legitimate cargo haulers in Stanton to salvage operators in Pyro, proving that Arden's compliance theater has done little to change who actually buys these hulls. So we must ask, has Drake truly reformed, or has it simply learned to sell the same ship twice, once to the law and once to those who break it? The industrial expansion that followed incorporation defied every projection from financial analysts tracking the spacecraft sector. Within 9 months of opening their first production line on Borea, Drake Interplanetary had established 6 off-world manufacturing facilities and secured licensed dealerships across 9 distinct systems. This wasn't gradual growth. It was an explosion that saw the company quadruple its operational capacity within a single fiscal year. By 2850, just 5 years after Dredge lost that UEE military contract for the Cutlass, Drake had become the 5th largest spacecraft manufacturing concern in human space. The same financial magazines that had dismissed the Cutlass as a failed military bid now praised Drake as the little engine that could, forcing established giants like Roberts Space Industries and Musashi Industrial to reconsider their pricing structures. But here's where the narrative shifts from corporate success story to something far more complicated. The carefully constructed facade cracked on April 6, 2947, when an undercover recording surfaced featuring Dredge candidly discussing sales of the Cutlass Black to known piracy groups. Family members of piracy victims immediately demanded a complete ban on Drake vessels, threatening to dismantle the empire built over a century of carefully cultivated outlaw romanticism. Facing mounting pressure, the board announced Dredge's retirement to spend time with her family, installing her son John Dredge as acting CEO while searching for permanent leadership. The transition lasted less than a year. In early 2948, the board convened in Odessa to introduce Arden as chief executive, a move reportedly opposed by both Dredge family members who had controlled the company since its inception. Arden's first official act condemned the use of Drake ships by outlaws and mandated that every sales associate attend annual training sessions, reviewing both company policy and empire-wide law. Arden recognized that mere policy changes couldn't erase decades of reputation, so she constructed an entirely new platform for corporate messaging. Drake DefenseCon emerged as an annual exhibition held in the shadow of Odessa's manufacturing towers, positioning the company's rough aesthetic against the polished galas common to Terra's corporate elite. These gatherings showcase the Cutlass alongside the Buccaneer and Corsair, emphasizing legitimate defense applications for militia groups operating in high-risk sectors like Pyro. While critics argue this amounts to laundering the company's image through technicalities, the event has successfully attracted contracts from planetary defense forces unwilling to pay premium prices for Aegis Dynamics hardware. The tension persists. Every DefenseCon banner proclaiming corporate responsibility hangs above show floors where independent contractors negotiate cash deals for vessels that will inevitably disappear into lawless regions. This duality defines modern Drake Interplanetary. Avi shipyards of Odessa on Borea, Magnus Roman II, presenting a gritty counterpoint to the polished galas thrown by Origin Jumpworks or Roberts Space Industries. Here, amidst functional dry docks rather than holographic showrooms, Arden displays the Cutlass Black, Caterpillar, and Buccaneer as essential equipment for independent operators navigating the lawless expanses of Pyro. The convention draws crowds that Aegis Dynamics would classify as high-risk, salvage crews, militia groups, and frontier haulers who prioritize utility over polish. By 2950, DefenseCon had anchored itself in the interstellar calendar, generating sufficient coverage to obscure the lingering litigation from families victimized by Cutlass raids. Arden's strategy relies on saturation. If enough legitimate pilots operate Drake hulls throughout Stanton and Terra, the statistical association with criminal elements might eventually blur into background noise rather than defining characteristic. Yet the rebranding faces an inconvenient truth that promotional campaigns cannot obscure. The Cutlass Black remains the most frequently spotted hull among 9 tails raiding parties operating throughout Stanton and Pyro, despite Arden's compulsory yearly instruction for every sales associate, implemented specifically to review empire-wide law regarding vessel distribution. Drake's quarterly earnings continue to benefit from gray market transactions that bypass official dealerships entirely. The company maintains its status as the 5th largest spacecraft producer in human space, a ranking achieved through the explosive expansion that followed the 2845 incorporation. Yet this scale now complicates rehabilitation efforts. When advocacy agents intercept smuggling rings, they invariably catalog another stolen or black market Cutlass, creating headlines that undermine DefenseCon's carefully constructed narratives. So how does a corporation shed its reputation when its products remain synonymous with the very outlaw culture it now publicly rejects? The answer may lie in the production network that Dredge established across 6 auxiliary production sites within 9 months of incorporation, creating an industrial momentum that transcends any single CEO's vision. From the headquarters in Odessa to licensed dealerships spanning 9 systems, Drake Interplanetary has embedded itself too deeply into the frontier economy to be dismantled by reputation alone. The Caterpillar hauler and Dragonfly hoverbike now generate profits that rival those of Musashi Industrial's freight divisions, while the Buccaneer fighter competes directly with Anvil Aerospace's military contracts. Even as Arden enforces compliance protocols introduced in early 2948, the geometric hull plating and low-tech accessibility that defined Dredge's original 2845 design philosophy continue attracting buyers who prioritize function over legal pedigree. Ultimately, Drake's story illustrates how industrial scale can outrun moral judgment, leaving the empire to grapple with a weapons manufacturer too essential to exile and too notorious to embrace. Single marketing campaign. By the close of 2846, Drake Interplanetary had established licensed dealerships across 9 distinct systems, with annual revenues quadrupling from their initial projections. Financial analysts at the time noted that Dredge's company had ascended to become the 5th largest spacecraft manufacturing concern in human space, challenging the dominance of Roberts Space Industries and Musashi Industrial in ways that seemed impossible just months prior. The Cutlass, originally rejected by the UEE as a military Volksfighter, found its true market among independent operators in high-risk sectors who valued modular versatility over polished aesthetics. Operating from the economically depressed system of Magnus, specifically the industrial world of Borea, Drake leveraged low overhead costs to undercut competitors while maintaining the rugged geometrical designs that would become their trademark. Corporate vulnerability arrived unexpectedly on April 6, 2947, when investigative journalists released undercover footage capturing Dredge explicitly discussing sales of the Cutlass Black to known piracy organizations operating beyond UEE jurisdiction. The recording triggered immediate condemnation from advocacy groups representing victims of spacer violence, who petitioned the Senate to impose comprehensive trade sanctions against Drake Interplanetary and demanded a complete ban on future Cutlass production. Rather than contest the allegations through legal channels, the board issued a formal press statement on that same April date, announcing Jan Dredge's immediate retirement to spend time with her family, while appointing her son John Dredge as acting chief executive officer. This transition failed to satisfy critics, who noted that the Dredge family retained effective control through the 7-member board dominated by original Cutlass designers, suggesting that leadership remained fundamentally unchanged. The controversy exposed how deeply the outlaw aesthetic had permeated corporate governance, transforming what began as marketing strategy into documented business practice that legitimized illicit commerce. Structural transformation arrived in early 2948, when Drake Interplanetary convened a press conference in Odessa to introduce Arden as chief executive officer, an appointment that reportedly occurred against the explicit wishes of both Jan and John Dredge. Arden immediately condemned the utilization of Drake vessels by outlaw elements and instituted mandatory annual training sessions requiring every sales associate to review corporate policy alongside local and empire-wide legal statutes. To rehabilitate public perception, the corporation established Drake DefenseCon as a yearly promotional exhibition held within the functional shipyards of Borea, showcasing the Cutlass alongside newer designs like the Buccaneer fighter and Caterpillar hauler to legitimate militia groups. These gatherings deliberately attract demographics that traditional manufacturers like Aegis Dynamics would classify as high-risk clientele, highlighting the persistent tension between Arden's compliance initiatives and the company's enduring market position as the 5th largest spacecraft producer in human space. Occurred against the wishes of the founding family. Arden took the helm with a mandate to dismantle the outlaw mythology that had defined the brand for a century. In his inaugural address on Borea, Arden publicly denounced the utilization of Drake hulls by criminal syndicates, a stark departure from the Dredge legacy. The new administration instituted mandatory annual compliance seminars for every sales associate across the 9 licensed dealerships, reviewing local statutes and empire-wide regulations. This procedural shift represented more than public relations theater. It signaled that the 5th largest spacecraft manufacturer intended to retain its market position without relying on the romanticized pirate aesthetic that had fueled the Cutlass Black's initial success. The question remained whether corporate policy could ever truly sever the symbiotic relationship between the manufacturer and the frontier's most notorious operators. Today, the corporation balances on a precipice between respectability and its foundational mythology. The yearly DefenseCon gatherings on Magnus Roman II still draw thousands to Odessa's industrial districts, though the emphasis has shifted toward legitimate military contracts and civilian cargo solutions like the Caterpillar hauler and Dragonfly hoverbike. While Aegis Dynamics dominates formal naval procurement, Drake retains its iron grip on militia and independent operator markets, maintaining production facilities across 6 off-world locations established during the initial 2846 expansion. The Cutlass Black remains their signature platform, yet marketing materials now frame the Buccaneer and Corsair as exploration vessels rather than boarding craft. This calculated ambiguity generates approximately 40% of revenue from systems beyond advocacy oversight, allowing Drake to profit from frontier volatility without explicitly endorsing the Nine Tails or other outlaw factions that still favor their rugged geometric hull designs. Reflecting on the century since Jan Dredge first sketched the Cutlass in 2845, we see a corporation that built an empire by embracing the gray zones of human expansion. From the loss of that initial UEE Volksfighter contract to the April 2947 scandal that forced her retirement, Drake Interplanetary has consistently weaponized institutional ambiguity, transforming economic desperation on Borea into the fifth largest manufacturing concern in human space. And in Arden's compliance protocols and yearly training mandates may have sanitized the corporate image. Yet every Cutlass Black still rolls off the Odyssey production line, with hardpoints designed for boarding actions and hull plating that withstands advocacy fire. The legacy endures not in press releases or DefenseCon stages, but in the silent understanding that when the quantum drive disengages in lawless space, the silhouette approaching your cargo hold will likely bear the unmistakable profile of a Drake Interplanetary vessel.